and I didn't prepare ahead of time, unless you say, well, I've been preparing my whole life for this moment, but that could be one interpretation too. I think that I am not the oldest survivor of the original 7 kids, but I'm one of the few, and I'm the oldest one here, that was actually a direct descendant of Kristian and Karina. And I think most of you have heard the story of Kristian and Karina, how they came to the United States and to Iowa ultimately, and then Minnesota. I just marvel at the courage they had to make that journey and leave their families, never to return and ever see them again. I mean, the other side of that story is things were so desperate and difficult back home in Norway at the time that their choices were kind of limited, and it made this one look like a good opportunity, and there was land available and there was this and that. Supposedly things would be better. And ultimately it worked out that way, but I'm sure at first it was no picnic. So they ultimately ended up in Iowa, and they came together at a church where they were opposite sides of wherever this Lutheran church was, around Spirit Lake or around Fonda, Iowa. And I'm not prepared enough to tell you more specifics than that. But there are stories that many of you have probably read, so you know about that. And they ultimately met at church, and Chris was hired to work for a tiling manufacturer that made farm field tiles, and he worked there, and then that was sort of okay. And then the owner of that factory asked him to manage a farm that the owner of this factory worked, and he went out there and worked, and that's where I think Thelma and Geneva and Borghild were born. I'm not sure about Karen, but she may have been born there, I'm not sure. And then because there wasn't a Lutheran church and it wasn't really a Norwegian community, Chris went up to Minnesota, and how he landed in the Cannon Falls area, I really don't know. But he came up by himself and he bought a farm. And the old home farm that's halfway between Denison and Cannon Falls. And he went back home and he got some livestock, I understand, very limited livestock that he owned, or they owned. And he came up on the train, and I don't know where he came to, if there was a stop out in the country, or if he got to Denison and walked his cows out to that farm, which would be probably 4 or 5 miles, or maybe there was another railroad stop just kind of out in the country back in those days. I don't know how that worked. And I've said to other people this weekend that the people that know the answers to some of the questions I've come up with are gone. And so, and it's not written down, so I can't tell you about that. But at any rate, the rest of their family were born at a farm near Denison. And there was Karen and Sam and Mert and Beldora. And so all together, 7 kids, and an amazing thing. Thelma was the first one to marry. She was the oldest, a beautiful young lady. I've seen pictures of her way back when, and I never saw her until near the end of her life when she got back to Minnesota. But all my life I'd heard about Thelma from my mother, and that every Christmas time she'd send a package or a gift to Thelma, who was hospitalized in New York. And I'll back up a little bit and tell a segment of that story. If it's time for me to shut down, start waving or something, and I'll come to the end of the story. And it can end any place, but I guess in a way it's not over yet. It continues today. But at any rate, Orrin grew up somewhere in the area, I think on a farm, and ultimately he and Thelma got together and they married. And Helen probably knows more about this than I do from having talked to Lyle about it, but they lived different places where he worked for, I don't know if it was a publishing company or something like a publishing company. So he was doing some non-farm in St. Paul. Okay, yeah. And then was Lyle born in Albert Lee, or does? Yes. Okay, so somehow.
Clarice was born on the farm.
Okay, So that's part of that story, how that all came together. And they had 4 children, as you know. Lyle was the oldest, and Clarice was next, and Dave, and then Arlene. And so they had the 4 children, and then he got a job offer. I think, was Arlene born in New York? I'm not sure. Yeah, okay, so they had 3 children, and Orrin had a job offer to go to, it involved going to New York. And New York in the late 20s was a long ways away. It's quite a ways away today. In fact, I've never been to New York City. It's a ways from here. And so he ultimately took that job, and there was Thelma with 3 kids, and then being pregnant, going to New York, and Orrin is working. And to have a new job in a faraway city at a time when long distance telephone was barely available. I'm not sure if the Giljes, or if the Giljes had a phone at that time back here in Minnesota. And they didn't have electricity yet, because that was the late 1930s before they got electricity. So things were different than what we're used to and take for granted today. So at any rate, she's a long ways from home, and and she didn't have an easy opportunity to talk to her parents or talk to her sisters or people back in Minnesota. And so and plus 4 little kids once Arlene was born, I'm sure she was pretty well tied to the house. I mean, our apartment, I'm not sure what that amounted to either, what kind of facilities they had, but or housing they had. But at any rate, it had to be lonesome beyond belief. If you can imagine having 4 kids and your husband off at work, and you're just pretty well tied down, and stress beyond words almost is what I would say. So anyway, things went on, and the word came back that Thelma's health was not good. She was having difficulty, and I'm not sure about the details of that, if there was some postpartum depression, and there's who knows what all it was, but there was just a lot going on that wasn't very good. And Orrin was busy. Now this is kind of what I picked up over my early years, is hearing what was going on. So ultimately it was decided, Karina and Chris thought, you know, these kids, they need some help to take care of them while Thelma's sick. And so my mother was, she was the 3rd one, Thelma, Geneva, and my mother. She was the 3rd one, and she was, she'd done some work as a pastry cook at Carleton College and St. Olaf College in Northfield, and she was single, but dating my father at that time. And so they talked about how in the world are we going to help these kids. And turns out my dad's brother, my dad and his brother were farming together as partners along with their father. So they were basically 3 men farming, and then my father's mother, they were got a household, they were living together. And the young boys were farming, my dad being one of them. And my dad's brother knew a fellow, his name was Sam Haugen, and he had a filling station, a gas station in Northfield, and he had a decent car. And in the late 30s, the Depression was not long, it was still kind of recovery going on, and hardly anybody had a decent car. And so they thought, well, Sam's got a good car, and he said we could use it, we could go to New York, and we could get those kids. And so, and my parents weren't married yet, so it really wasn't appropriate for them to take a road trip across the United States. And so what happened is something that's bizarre. I don't know yet how that all transpired, and I didn't ask the right questions when people alive knew the answers. But at any rate, my dad's brother and his buddy had this car, and my mother went with them, and they drove straight through to New York. Now, driving straight through to New York today would be stressful. It'd be hard, and there's interstate highways. Back then, I'm assuming that there was blacktop if you went or took the right route, and you could get to New York from here. So they drove, legend has it, straight through to New York, and my mother told a story. When they got to New York, there was a traffic circle, a roundabout, and their roundabouts have only been around here for probably 10, 15 years in Minnesota, but back east, and maybe at New York, maybe that's the only one in the country. She said they went around this roundabout 3 times or so before they figured out how to get off the roundabout and get into the Holland Tunnel, under the Hudson River, and into Manhattan. So they went into Manhattan, drove across Manhattan, and got across the bridge into Brooklyn, which is where Thelma and Orrin and the kids were living. And I'm thinking they stayed there 2 or 3 days or nights to rest up a little bit because of their grueling trip. And then it was time to come home. And so they put Lyle and David and Clarice in the back seat of this little 2-door car, and my mother sat in the middle on the split front seat, and one of the guys on either side of her, and she was holding Arlene, the baby. And they drove straight through back to Minnesota. And I can't believe that either, with the 4 kids. I mean, talk about stress and exhaustion. They had to, when they traded drivers, they had to do some sleeping along the way, all of them. And yet they kept on going, according to legend, according to the way I understand it. And there's a photo, and I wish I could find it. If I do, I'll share it with some of you, but there's a picture of my mother changing Arlene's diaper in a grassy road ditch somewhere between here and New York. And it's it had to be quite a trip. Yeah. And so they got back to the Gilje farm, and the kids lived there. And you've heard part of this story. Some of you have, but some of you hadn't. Time went by, and they began to think of Kristian and Karina, their grandparents, as Ma and Pa. And that's what they called them. I was there. I grew up between Denison and Northfield, which is probably a dozen miles from the Gilje farm. And so we got over there frequently, and I saw these kids. I'm younger. I don't even know how much younger, but they were just the big kids all my life. And I suppose I was 8 years younger than Arlene or something like that. Maybe 10. I'm not. I don't even know. I should know, but I apologize. When was Arlene born? 36, and I was born in 40. Okay, 36. I was born in 42. So 6 years difference. And when you're 6, 12 seems like a lot, and it's not. It's not that much difference. But so Arlene was 6 years older than I. In fact, I remember when my brother was born in 1950. Arlene came along on a fishing trip with us to babysit my brother, so my mother and dad and I could go out and fish together. And so she came to the cabin up. I don't know. I'm going to say it wasn't Hackensack. It was up north someplace, and we did that. So that's a whole separate story. But at any rate, so the kids get settled, and they're here. And at somewhere along the line, and now here's where I might need to be shut down a little bit, but Orrin came up with, he wanted to get his kids back. Is there any truth to that?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, he wanted to bring his kids back to New York. So he came out to the farm and paid a visit, and the detail that I heard about was that it was time to go back to New York, and they wanted to get the kids, let's all get in the car, we're heading back. And so they opened the door of the car, and Lyle gets in, and Clarice gets in, and David gets in, and Lyle gets in the one door, and he goes out the other door. He just goes right through the car, doesn't stop in the car like it was intended, and the other kids followed him. So the message was they didn't want to go to New York. They wanted to stay with Ma and Pa on the farm at Denison. And Lyle might have been old enough when he came back to remember what the constrictive living in New York was like, and he liked the farm, he liked Ma and Pa, and he knew that he had some stability there, and he wasn't so sure. There might have been stability, but there might not. And he was mature enough and wise enough to say, I don't know if this is going to work, and he just didn't think it was a good risk.
Well, they were then at home with Grandpa and Grandma.
They were.
By that time,
yes.
That was home.
They had settled in. That was home. They were like a member of the family, and Belle was.
Orrin got his brother Arthur, and they tried to forced Lyle to go to New York with him. And Lyle fought like crazy, and Arthur said, I can't do this. I absolutely can't do it. And with one of the reunions we had here, Olga and Palmer, you know, that's Orrin's sister, said that the last while Orrin had a terrible time living with Selma. He would come home from work, and she kept bathing the children one after another because she couldn't remember which one they'd bathe. And every night he'd have to pull out the refrigerator, make sure there's nothing underneath there, and then pull out the stove. It was really hard. And Lyle remembers seeing his mother in the window of the hospital, and he said, I knew I was never going to see my mother again. And Arlene insisted that Lyle must remember more, but he did not. I think it was such a traumatic thing that it was just blocked out of his mind.
So the kids ended up staying with Ma and Pa, their grandparents, on the farm at Denison, and they grew up there, and they went to school there.
And Val, your grandma told me that the way those birthdays fell would be Lyle and Clarice, and then Lyle and Clarice, then Val, and actually one woman could have had all five. Can you imagine what a shock that must have been for Val when those four kids came?
Yeah.
She was like an only child at that point.
And a shock for Karina, where she'd raised her own 7 kids. All of a sudden, here's 4 young ones, and she had one of her own in the middle of the 4 Egland kids. Belle was right in the middle, and so Belle became like a sister for the other 4. And they ended up growing up together, and they went to high school. There wasn't bus service at that time, early, so they went to high school.
With Karen for quite a while.
They lived with their sister, Thelma's sister, their aunt, Karen Prehall, in Northfield during the school year, and maybe they'd go home on some weekends. I don't know the detail of that, but I remember seeing them.
Tell me in the weekends he would run home, and Grandpa and Grandma would take him back. That's probably Sunday night, but he would run home when he get home.
Wow, run home.
And Lyle developed some friends at high school, of course, as I'm sure they all did, in Northfield, but then they went back to the farm east of Denison, which was quite a ways away. It must be.
Clarice and Lyle stayed in Northfield to go to high school, but by the time David could go to high school, then I think must have had a school bus.
They got a bus. I think that Kathleen has told me David lived with them for a year maybe, and then the school bus route became available, and so he lived with the Giljes on the farm and went to high school that way. So that's kind of how they grew up. And I could what can I remember about Kristian and Karina? I remember that they came to Denison because it was a Norwegian Lutheran community, and there was a Norwegian Lutheran church close by, and it was a vast improvement for where they were. How they came up with the money and the guts to buy a farm, I think it was 120 acres that they ended up with east of Denison there, and they didn't have, all of my life they had electricity, but they didn't have indoor plumbing. And I'm not sure, I think I don't know if they had a telephone the whole all of my life or not, but they had it when I had a little bit of age on me. They did have a telephone, but it was still, even that, you didn't make extra long distance calls because there was an extra upcharge for long distance, and so you didn't waste those minutes if you called, if you had a relative you wanted to talk to. And I remember, one thing I remember is Grandma Karina was very outgoing, and she could talk, and she had a pretty heavy Norwegian accent, but you could understand her clearly, and she wasn't afraid to talk to anybody. Now, Chris, on the other hand, was more laid back or more quiet, and I think he understood every word of English that he heard, but he wasn't confident to speak very much. So to me, when I was a little guy, he was quiet. He just didn't say a lot. I knew he was there, and if you asked him something, you could get an answer, but it wasn't like he was gonna
tell us about the secrets of life or any world stuff, you know. I mean, he just was reluctant to speak in English. He just was kind of a quiet guy. And he died when I was in college. I'd finished it with finals week during my second year of college, and I came down for the funeral because he passed away, and that was 1962. And then in 1967, Karina died, and in between there, Belle and Elmer ended up somewhere along the line. They moved to the farm, the Gilje farm, and they lived there with Karina so they could help her and take care of her and be part of her life, and that's kind of what they did. And Elmer went off to work. They did some different things, but he worked for Swift Packing Company for a while. For a while they were going to start a taxi company. I don't know if that ever materialized. They thought about some ideas of things that they were going to do, but living on the farm is what they did. And then I might kind of pause there for a minute and see if anybody has any questions or if you'd like me to go somewhere else. Terry.
So I remember when they put the bathroom in at her house, and I remember that, you know, where they put the bathroom in, there was a steps that had the pie shape going up behind it, and then it was in the front corner of the house. And I remember looking at the hole out front that they had dug to put the septic tank in, and it was going out the front, and then there was a yard, and then there was huge lilac bushes, I believe, like 50 feet tall compared to me, but probably only 20. Okay, so I remember that, and I didn't understand why it was a big deal at the time. And I remember my dad out there working on that. I don't know who else was there, but I know he was working, trying to put that in.
I'm sure of that, and I remember that also. And I don't know, I think it was after Chris had died,
yes,
that they put in that bathroom. Yes. And Virgil was key in doing that because the Hernkeys, I think, had a backhoe, you know, that they could dig and make a trench and dig a ditch and put in tile and all that stuff. And they did the work, I think, like you say, themselves.
Right.
It was done by family members, and so all the girls grew up and left without a bathroom in the house. This was somewhat later. And I had some other cousins on my dad's side that grew up, graduated from high school, no bathroom in the house, and until the whole way through school. And it's stuff that we wouldn't even think of it, dream of it, if we didn't know that's the way it was. And they
even when we were living there at first, we lived there for a few years, there was no bathroom.
Yes.
You went outside to the outhouse, and then you had a big round wash tub that you took a bath in.
That's right. I forgot, wasn't looking at you when I was talking. I should have called on you to make some comments, Karina.
Do you remember the bathroom going in?
Yes, yeah.
Did I remember right?
Yeah.
I remember it, yes. And there's the milk house or the pump house on the same building. Something that looks just like it is still there. I don't know how much of it's been repaired.
I'd like to see, because we put all our handprints in it.
Oh,
Yeah.
you might find that. Yeah.
So I'd like to go see one.
Used to go out and get a bucket of water for drinking. You know, there was an electric pump during my lifetime. There used to be a hand pump, I'm sure, before that. But you could go out and turn on the pump, and you put the bucket in under there, and when the bucket's full, take it into the house, and you set it on the counter in the kitchen. There was a dry sink there, which means there's no pipes to it. But I think there was a drain, and there was a dipper in there. So anybody that came, guests, anybody, friends, relatives, if you want a drink, you take the dipper and you just dip in the bucket, and you get a drink of water. Yeah. And today we probably would say, well, you know, you could get cold doing that. But back then, people didn't give it a thought. It was absolutely not even considered.
Did they have silver in the water source? Piece of silver?
No.
Because silver was used a lot of times to sterilize the water that you drew.
Really?
Yeah, just a silver coin or a little piece. And that was used in milk houses and in water supplies all the time. And that's been used for millennia.
I don't remember that.
Okay.
I maybe wasn't paying attention, but I don't remember. There were some gutters on the house, like eave troughs, and there was a drain that came off the roof and went into a cistern that was under the kitchen. And then there was a hand pump in the kitchen sink, and you could pump water out of that cistern underneath the kitchen floor. And that water was not used for drinking, obviously, and I don't know if it was used for washing dishes or what it was. Maybe Karina knows that. I don't know what that water was used for. There was water, you could wash your hands, and probably that was good enough for washing your hands, but not good enough to drink. And you just pump a little bit, and there's a wash dish and a drain. And so they had water in the house, so to speak, but not water you should drink. That was carried in a bucket.
We heated it up to wash the dishes.
Okay, sure, that makes sense. And it was like a wood stove?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then they had, throughout the house, they had heaters, fuel oil heaters, like in the dining room and in the living room. We'd go over for Christmas and we'd fill the house with people. There were kids and grandkids, and we'd go out sliding on the hills in the pasture and so on. And they still had some cows when Dave and Lyle helped milk cows, and probably Our Lady and Clarice did too. I don't know about that, but I know that Dave and Lyle did. And so they were part of the farm operation and helped, so to speak, like kids do.
I know I first went down there in 1953. There weren't any livestock then.
Okay. Yeah, I remember when they had the cows, and they only had maybe 6 cows or 4 to 8 cows or something like that. Not a lot of cows. And then they had their neighbor to the west in the first place south was Joe Casa, and he had a milk truck, and he'd come and pick up the milk cans every day and go and take them to the creamery, wherever that was, and bring back. They had twice as many cans as they needed, so he'd bring back the empty cans from yesterday and then pick up the full ones and take them to the creamery. So that was one thing they did. They also had a turkey when I was a little guy, and this turkey would chase me. He knew I was afraid of him, and I was afraid of him. I was afraid of him. He'd come tearing out when he'd see me outside alone, and I just head for the house, and I was glad that Thanksgiving when we came in. So that took care of that problem. So let's see, there are 1,000 other little tidbits of stories, but it's been a lot of fun for me to share them with you.
Why don't you tell a little bit about you and Kathleen visiting Grandma and Grandpa and staying with them?
Okay, yeah, I